All right, how's it going, everyone? In this video, I'd like to cover the process of breathing and some of the factors that affect the rate and the depth of breathing, or what we call respiration. And so let's get right into it. So first, I'd like to talk about sort of a very simple physics topic, which is pressure relationships with volume. So when we talk about inspiration or inhalation and expiration or exhalation, they're going to be dependent on the differences in pressure between the atmosphere outside and the pressure within our lungs and our body. In this case, right here on the left, the force exerted by the movement of the gas molecules against the walls of this 2-liter chamber is lower than the force that's exerted by the gas molecules in this 1-liter chamber. And the reason for that is because as the volume increases, pressure decreases, or vice versa. As volume decreases, pressure increases, okay? And so basically that's just a simple rule that you'll need to just keep in mind as volume increases, pressure decreases. Now, what are some other ways that you could change the pressure in these two symptoms? Well, by adding more molecules, you would increase the pressure as well. And by changing the temperature, which would either speed up or slow down the way the molecules move, that would change the pressure as well. But really what I'm trying to get at here is the relationship between volume and pressure. So let's talk about pulmonary ventilation. It's going to be dependent on 3 types of pressure: atmospheric, intraalveolar, and intrapleural. So atmospheric pressure is just the amount of force that's exerted by gases in the air surrounding any given surface, like such as our body, right? There's atmospheric pressure that we, as humans that live on Earth, experience every day. Then there's intraalveolar pressure, which is also called intrapulmonary pressure, and it's the pressure of the air within our alveoli. And that changes during the different phases of breathing, but it always equalizes with the atmospheric pressure. Okay, so it's always going to equalize, make itself equal with our atmospheric pressure. And then lastly is the intrapleural pressure, and it's the pressure of the air within our pleural cavity, and it's between the visceral and the parietal pleurae. And this pressure is always lower than the intraalveolar pressure. Okay, so a lot of words here, but let's keep going. The difference in pressures that we see between the intraalveolar and our intrapleural pressure, that drives pulmonary ventilation, because air, like you've seen in the previous videos, flows down a pressure gradient, or basically air flows from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. And so it makes sense that if you want the oxygen molecules to get into your body, you would have, as you get further into the body, lower pressure. Inspiration, of course, is the process that causes air to enter the lungs. That's breathing in, inspiration, and expiration is breathing out, the process that causes air to leave the lungs. And then if you do one breathe in and one breathe out, that's called a respiratory cycle, or it's just the sequence of inspiration and expiration. What you see is that in general, 2 muscle groups are used during inspiration and expiration: the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. And then if we take larger breaths, additional muscles will be used. But basically, what you see is that when the diaphragm contracts, this is on the left side here, it moves inferiorly towards the abdominal cavity. You can see it's moving down here, and that creates a larger thoracic cavity, which gives basically more space for your lungs, okay? Then contraction of your internal intercostals right here, contraction of the external, not internal, external intercostal muscles moves the ribs up and out. So it moves the ribs up and out, and it causes the rib cage to expand, and that also increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. So basically, you just want more space for your lungs to obviously take in this air. The expansion of the thoracic cavity basically forces the lungs to stretch and expand as well, because in the pleural cavity, that liquid has some pressure in it, some surface tension, and that causes the surface of your lungs to spread and expand. The increase in volume leads to a decrease in the intraalveolar pressure, which creates that pressure that's lower than the atmospheric pressure, and as a result, that pressure gradient is created that drives air into the lungs. The process of expiration, here on the right, it's passive, meaning that you don't have to expend any energy to push air out of the lungs. Instead, since your lung tissue is elastic, it causes the lung to just recoil to its original size, and as the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles will relax, that pushes, it turns your thoracic cavity and your lungs into a decreased volume, and that just causes an increase in the intrapulmonary pressure, which causes the air to escape your body. So there's different types or modes of breathing. You're probably hearing me do the latter. And basically these different types will require a slightly different process in order for things to go down the way they should. So quiet breathing, maybe what you're doing right now, is also known as eupnea, and it's a mode of breathing that occurs at rest. It doesn't require the cognitive thought, right? You're usually not, well, now that I say it, you probably are thinking about breathing. Don't you hate that? But no, you usually don't have to think about this. You're doing it all the time, and the diaphragm and the external intercostals are doing work. A deep breath, which you're hearing me do quite a bit, that's called diaphragmatic breathing, and it just requires the diaphragm to contract much, much more, and the diaphragm relaxes. As the diaphragm relaxes, air will just passively leave the lungs. And then we have something that's called a shallow breath, which is called costal breathing. It requires contraction of the intercostal muscles, but not as much of the diaphragm. And of course, as intercostal muscles relax, air will passively leave the lungs as well. Then we have what you're hearing me do, which is forced breathing, which is called hyperpnea. And basically, it's a mode of breathing that can occur during exercise or actions that require active manipulation of breathing, singing or doing what I'm doing, lecturing in class, right? During forced breathing, inspiration and expiration both occur due to muscle contractions. In addition to the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, you'll have the other accessory muscles have to contract, like muscles in the neck during inspiration, including the scalenes, which are on the sides of your neck. That'll contract and lift the thoracic wall even more. That increases lung volume, of course. And then expiration, you'll have more muscles in your abdomen, including obliques, which will contract, force your abdominal organs up and against the diaphragm, just pushing your lungs out even more, because we're dealing with a huge difference in volume of air compared to the quiet or the shallow breathing. In addition, those accessory muscles, primarily the intercostals, will compress your rib cage, which also reduces the volume of the thoracic cavity and your lungs. Here's where we're going to get into respiratory volume, and I'm just going to put this image up while I talk about it. It's the term, respiratory volume, it's the term used for various volumes of air moved by or associated with the lungs at any given point in your respiratory cycle. There's four major types of respiratory volumes. There's tidal volume, and there's residual volume, and there's inspiratory reserve volume, and expiratory reserve volume. And so we'll talk about each of those really quick. So tidal volume, right here, it is the amount of air that normally enters your lung during quiet breathing. You can see here that tidal volume is somewhere around 500 milliliters. And expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air you can forcefully exhale past a normal tidal expiration, just past normal quiet breathing. So you take a deep breath in, and as much as you can blow out, that's expiratory reserve. And that's about 1,200 milliliters for men, a little less for females. Inspiratory reserve volume, or IRV, it's produced by a deep inhalation past regular tidal respiration. This is the extra volume that you could bring into your lungs during a forced, very deep breath. Then we've got residual volume, and residual volume is just the air that's left in the lungs if you were able to blow out as much as possible. The reason that we have a residual volume of air is to make breathing easier, because if you keep some air in your lungs at all times, your alveoli won't collapse. And of course, if the alveoli collapse, that's not a good thing. Let's see. So Respiratory volume in general is going to be dependent on a variety of factors. Of course, some are based on your genetics, some are based on what you're doing in your everyday life. But you can obviously go to the doctor and they can measure all of these, and it can provide important clues about your respiratory health. You know, things like working out, doing a lot of aerobic exercise can increase it. Obviously, smoking and being overweight can decrease it. Just things like that. Obviously, many other things as well that I'm not listing there. One example, if your total lung capacity, which is the sum of all the lung volumes, basically, if you were healthy, a healthy male, that's about 6,000 milliliters and about 4,200 milliliters for women. So that's your total lung capacity over here. Vital capacity, right here, it's the amount of air a person can move into or out of his or her lungs, and it's the sum of all the volumes except residual volume. You can see here. So here's total lung capacity, here's vital capacity, and that's without the residual. Remember, residual is just what we keep in our lungs so that our alveoli don't collapse. So you could think of vital capacity as like what you could possibly breathe in and breathe out, which keeps you alive, and that's vital capacity. I don't know, that's how I think about it. That's between 4,000 and 5,000 milliliters. Then the inspiratory capacity, it's the maximum amount of air that can be inhaled past a normal breath, just basically the deepest inhale you can do. And it's the sum of tidal volume and inspiratory reserve. Right, you can see that right here. The colors match up here. And then on the other hand, you have the functional residual capacity, which is right here. It's the amount of air that remains in the lung after a normal exhale. So not the deepest exhale you can do, but just a normal exhale. And it's the sum of the expiratory reserve volume and, of course, your residual volume. Okay, so there's a lot of terms here, but obviously pretty good exam questions here. What does inspiratory capacity, what does that entail? And then you'd have to select what it matches up to. I don't know, things like that, but all of these are terms that I'd like you to know. Okay, let's talk about respiratory rate, or basically just breathing rate. So normally, breathing is usually occurring throughout the day. You're not thinking about it. But sometimes you can, such as when you're swimming, you're holding your breath, you're underwater, you're singing a song, you're lecturing, talking at a computer like I am, or blowing bubbles. That was another one. But the respiratory rate is just your total number of breaths or respiratory cycles that occur each minute. And that can be an important factor of disease, an indicator of disease, I should say. The rate might increase or decrease during an illness, or if you have a specific disease condition. This respiratory rate is controlled by the respiratory center located within the medulla oblongata in the brain. Remember, we talked about the brain and where the medulla oblongata sits. And that responds primarily to changes in carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH levels in the blood. And we'll talk about that at one of the last slides in this lecture. Just interesting facts here. The normal respiratory trait of a human actually decreases as you age. So a child under 1 year has a normal respiratory rate of about 30 to 60 breaths a minute, almost 1 breath a second at the maximum there. That's pretty crazy. But by the time you're about 10 years old, that's closer to 18 to 30, and by puberty or adolescence, the normal respiratory rate is like that of adults, which is 12 to 18 breaths per minute. I never thought about how many times I breathe during a minute on a normal time. So let's talk about the control centers. And anytime we talk about control centers, we're talking about parts of the brain, right? So I just said the medulla oblongata is where this happens, and it contains 2 control centers, the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, the VRG. The DRG, or the dorsal respiratory group, it's involved in maintaining the constant breathing rhythm by stimulating the diaphragm and your intercostal muscles to contract, which obviously results in inspiration. And then when it stops stimulating them, of course, this doesn't take any energy, like I say, so the diaphragm and intercostals relax, and expiration, or air, rushes out on its own. The ventral respiratory group, the VRG, it's involved in forced breathing. So when you have to actually think about it, that's when the VRG is involved. And as the neurons in the VRG stimulate accessory muscles, like your neck muscles, like the scalenes, and also the more of your intercostals, that's involved in your forced breathing to contract and relax resulting in the forced inspiration and expiration. Then we've got the group, the control center in the pons, which is called the pontine or the pontine respiratory group. Of course, it's located in the pons, and it consists of the apneustic and the pneumotaxic centers. The apneustic center is a double cluster of these neuronal cell bodies that stimulate neurons in the dorsal respiratory group, and it controls your depth of inspiration, particularly for deep breathing or when you have to take a deep breath like I do right now. Um, the pneumotaxic center, it's a network of neurons that actually inhibits the activity of your DRG. That allows for relaxation after inspiration and basically controls the overall rate of your regular breathing at rest. So there's a couple of control centers for you, and let's move on. Let's talk about factors that affect the rate and depth of respiration. So I just said those control centers are in your medulla and your pons, but they themselves don't control it by themselves. They have to react from stimuli that are coming from your body. And it's basically a dose response, which is a negative feedback, one of those negative feedback relationships, in which the greater the stimulus, the greater the response. And that'll make sense in just a second. So contrary to what maybe some people might believe, it's not oxygen in your blood that is the number one basically dose response factor or stimulus for how fast you're breathing. It's actually carbon dioxide levels in the blood. And you know that working out or doing things like that are causing your muscles to do a lot of work increases cell respiration, and one of the byproducts of cell respiration is carbon dioxide. And so obviously, when your body starts to realize that there is a lot of excess carbon dioxide in the blood, that will increase your respiration in order to get rid of that carbon dioxide and bring in more oxygen. The rest of this is all going to be sort of subsets of carbon dioxide levels, because another factor is your systemic arterial concentration, or basically the amount of hydrogen ions in your bloodstream. And that actually occurs by increasing carbon dioxide levels, which leads to increased proton or H+ levels, which decreases the pH of your blood, makes it more acidic. And so when your blood becomes more acidic, the way to bypass that is to obviously increase it, so that increases your depth and the rate of the respiration as well. And then finally, which is surprisingly the third on the hierarchy here, is blood levels of oxygen. Of course, that's important, but if you're following along with us, you know that most of the oxygen molecules in your blood are bound to hemoglobin at any one time. And so it actually takes an extremely low level of blood levels of oxygen for your body to really make a difference and to really know anything's going on. And what happens is when there's an extremely low level of oxygen in the blood, the hemoglobin will release oxygen back into the bloodstream, and then even past that is when your body would realize that there's a low level of oxygen in the blood and we need to increase our respiratory rate. But the other things like levels of carbon dioxide and the pH of the blood, or basically the levels of hydrogen ions in the blood, are going to be superior to that. Lastly here, the hypothalamus and other brain regions that are associated with the limbic system can also play roles in influencing breathing, and they interact with the respiratory centers. If you remember anything about the hypothalamus, they're involved in regulating your responses to emotions, pain, temperature, and we've all realized this before. If you've been very hot, you feel excited, your flight or flight response is kicking in, you're feeling very sad, your respiratory rate will start to increase. And so that's due to your hypothalamus and other regions of your limbic system. Okay, and so with that, that's everything about breathing and factors that affect it. I look to see you in the next video.